Okay, here we go. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time of day it is. I hope it's good to be where you are, because it is certainly good to be here. My name is Baltimore Fats, and this is the continuation of Mud City. All right, so here we go. Uh, Yesterday I left off with Charles Carroll of Carrollton, because you can't have enough Charleses or Carrolls when you're in Baltimore. And he was the signer. He was the only Catholic signer of the Declaration of Independence, and richest man in America, and the most educated, had the highest level of education, right? So I was trying to demonstrate how, the American Revolution could have been staged coming right out of this place here, Mount Clair, through the barrister. That's the barrister's house and his Carroll family connections. They're cousins, Charles Carroll and the barrister, and also through Tench here, who was George Washington's right-hand man, but also this man's brother-in-law, right? Because he married Tench's sister. And so I'm trying to connect all of this to the United States Army Corps of Engineers. And because I can't, I didn't bring up the map. When starting my series, I realized that, I started thinking about what would need to happen if Baltimore really was covered in mud. You would need to get rid of that mud, at least some of it, right? Because they certainly left some of it behind. They didn't fully excavate the whole town down to its base level. It would certainly look a whole lot different, I believe, today. And these other major cities around the world would look very, very different today if they got rid of all of it. But they had to get rid of some of it, all right? They had to do some digging. And I came across a map of Locust Point, which is where Fort McHenry is, and there were train tracks on there, and the map was dated from 1850. And so that line of logic brought me to the United States Army Corps of Engineers, who still have offices on Locust Point next to Fort McHenry. And so I said, well, could it be that the United States Army Corps of Engineers is the organization responsible for digging us out from the mud event? So now it's time to take a slightly closer look at the Army Corps of Engineers, at least a couple of the people involved, and see, can we tie the United States Army Corps of Engineers to Baltimore? And I believe that we can. All right, so it says it's a U.S. federal agency under the Department of Defense and a major Army command made up of 37,000 civilian and military personnel, making it one of the world's largest public engineering, design, and construction management agencies, which is interesting to me that they would say Department of Defense and public. I don't think those things are really that closely connected. Although generally associated with dams, canals, and flood protection in the United States Army Corps of Engineers is involved in a wide range of public works. And that's what, it's like city design, right? Public buildings, transport infrastructure, public spaces, and public services, right? That's what all that says. It says the Corps of Engineers provide outdoor recreation opportunities to the public and provides 24% of the U.S. hydropower capacity, which is interesting, right? Now, I wonder how much of that is inherited. And look at these old, see? Those are old. I bet there was something here. They were using this river before. Anyway, that's 100% speculation based on a photograph I looked at for 2 seconds. Sorry, guys. It is the Corps' mission to deliver vital public and military engineering. Hold on, I realize I don't have my timer, so let me get that going here. And there we go. Okay. Sorry, guys. Deliver vital public and military engineering services, partnering in peace and war. How do you partner in peace and war? to strengthen our nation's security, energize the economy, and reduce risks from disasters. Well, I think they're kind of failing in that regard, right? You look at some of the disasters that have happened here in Maryland. There's a town that's actually connected to the first line of passenger railroad, Ellicott City, and Ellicott City has been devastated in the last few years by major floods. And then you look at New Orleans and so many other places. Yeah, I mean, maybe the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers isn't doing such a good job in reducing the risk from disaster, right? But their most visible missions include planning, designing, building, and operating locks and dams, other civil engineering projects, right, that include flood control, beach nourishment, and dredging for waterway navigation, the design and construction of flood protection systems through various federal mandates. I mean, design and construction and management of military facilities for the Army and the Air Force. Environmental regulation and ecosystem restoration. And now this is where things get interesting for me. When I read all of that stuff, I mean, all of this just says they're reworking the landscapes. So, I mean, just because they're telling us it's to make, to reduce risk from disaster and energize the economy, and it's for public works and civil service. I mean, they could be destroying the evidence, right? Who knows? Especially going back to its earliest times and before. Who's keeping those records? Who's watching the Watchmen there? So there's nothing to me that says, especially in this speculative world that we live in, that they couldn't have been totally, digging certain things out, destroying evidence of other things, and using the auspices of war as a cover story to make up for, the presence of, large groups of men and, and loud sounds, perhaps charges and explosive sounds and things like this. Because there would have been some farmers, and again, I speculate that the population numbers are greatly inflated in the population totals that they give us, and I'm going to get into some of that a bit later too. So there would have been some citizenry, there would have been farmers and things like this around, and so they needed a cover story for the sounds of all of this, right? And so, the cover story is the creating of the armed forces and the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, and they're going up and down the continent, especially in those original 13 colony states, and they're blowing stuff up. Right? And they're rebuilding and they're digging and they're making all kinds of, so you fortify these cities, you keep, prying eyes away, you blame it on a war with the British, who you've created using the techniques implemented by men like Charles Carroll. And, I don't know my history that well, and I didn't research him at all, but like people like Thomas Paine, right? I would imagine, is he from around this time, or is he earlier, or is he not even connected? I don't know. The name is jumping into my head for a reason, but so across the main, they would use techniques about the taxation, and they would create these phony pretenses using all the law that these people have come over, all of these lawyers who go back to England, who go back to France to study law. Here's what they're doing. They're just scheming. They're coming up with a way. They have to write the history, but they know that there's not going to be a decent enough record of what they're really doing because they're too slick for that. So they get to, pick and choose what they want going forward, and they weren't dumb men, although sometimes I bet they enjoyed making themselves look dumb, just as the politicians do today, just as Trump does today, not that I'm not, and other politicians, I mean, it's, but Trump just is the example because he draws so much attention to himself, and any reasonable person has to understand that some of that is on purpose. He's doing that. That's deliberate actions on his part. however you feel about them, and certainly I have my own feelings about them that I'm not going to use this as a political platform. He's just an example because he is so out there and he does, you know, does does say and do some pretty ridiculous things. Um, so again, I don't think it's that big a stretch, you know, and especially when you get back into the ties with the red and the white and West Point, and all the Star Fort connections that are found along the Hudson River and New York, which is conveniently enough. And let's get into the early history here a little bit. And again, just as always, I have to remind myself and anybody else that Wikipedia is not, the bastion of truth, so we have to take whatever information we get from Wikipedia with grains of salt. And but again, I'm just using it because it is the easiest source, and so here we go. The history of the United States Army Corps of Engineers can be traced back to 16 June 1775, when the Continental Congress, and when I first thought about doing this, I wanted to bring up the list of the Continental Congress delegates, but I forgot to do that. Maybe I can get into, there's a list of delegates here. And so the Continental Congress in 1775 creates an army. There wasn't really an army before, so they create the army, right? And they give him, they say Washington needs a chief engineer, right? And so this Colonel Richard Gridley becomes the first chief engineer of the army. And the Continental Congress recognized the need. One of his first tasks was to build fortifications near Boston at Bunker Hill. Okay. And we're going to get to that in a second because it's really interesting to me. The Continental Congress recognized the need for engineers trained in military fortifications and asked the government of King Louis XVI of France for assistance. Many of the early engineers in the Continental Army were French officers. Louis Lebigueux Duportet, I'm going to pretend that sounded French, right? A lieutenant colonel in the French Royal Army Corps of Engineers, was secretly sent to. Why the secrecy? We're by 1777, we're actively engaged in war, and the French are our open allies, I believe, in this. I don't know. So I wonder what the big secret was there. Where he was promoted to brigadier general. When the Continental Congress created a separate Corps of Engineers in May of 1779, Duportet was designated as its commander. In late 1781, he directed the construction of the Allied U.S.-French siege works at the Battle of Yorktown. From 1794 to 1802, the engineers were combined with the artillery as the Corps of Artillerists and Engineers, which is interesting. So I want to talk about some of this real quick and its connections. I probably shouldn't have gone so far. So anyway, this Richard Gridley becomes the first chief engineer, right? And so he was a French, right? He was a military engineer during the French and Indian Wars, right? So he has French connections, right? For his services, he was awarded a commission in the British Army and a grant of the Magdalene Islands, 3,000 acres, of land in New Hampshire, and a life annuity. So he was heavily rewarded for his participation in the French and Indian War. Now, I have done no research on the French and Indian War, but just this statement alone is interesting to me, that fighting in the French and Indian War, he would get a commission to the British Army and all this reward from them. And then he gets a commission to the British Army, but when the colonies decide to have declare war or you know, fight for independence, the 13 colonies. He decides to side with them, right? Yeah, I fought for the French, and the British, gave me this great commission, 3,000 acres in New Hampshire and a life. They're going to pay me for the rest of my life, but you guys need me, and I don't agree with what these Brits are doing anyway, right? So he sides with them, and he was made chief engineer, right? And he laid out the defensive on Breed's Hill, all right? Breed's Hill. So one of the first things he does as an engineer says Breed's Hill is a glacial drumlin located in the Charlestown section of Boston, Massachusetts, and is best known as the location in the Revolutionary War where most of the fighting of the Battle of Bunker Hill took place. So what's a glacial drumlin, right? So a drumlin from the Irish word droiminen, littlest ridge, first recorded in 1833. So they didn't even come up with the word drumlin until after the Battle of Bunker Hill by, a long time, 50 years, some 50 years. And in the classical sense is an elongated hill in the shape of an inverted spoon or half-buried egg. So it's just a mound, right? Formed by glacial ice acting. You couldn't be burying something there, could you? You couldn't have, that couldn't be a deliberate covering of something and then, hey, look, it's this hill isn't artificial at all. It was based on a weird glacial movement that we're not even going to name for another 25 years. I don't know. That story is fishy to me. That reeks more of engineering than of I mean, they mention it's fortification. I don't know. I don't think that's a natural thing. I think that's part of the tunnel system that was being built. I'm sure there's a star fort around there. I didn't research this thing out fully because again, I'm gonna do. If I did, as I've said before, if I really started to do this as a full-on project from Jump Street, it would never get done. It would just be endless working and tweaking. But by forcing myself to be loose and have fun, I've put something out there, and it's given me a skeleton for something to do a much major project with later. And so that's the way I'm kind of looking at it. So who's at Bunker? Who else? Who's at Bunker Hill? Right, well, General Washington, right? First chief engineer, so his forces, his men are on the ground there. And who's his number one guy? Tench Tillman's his number one guy. So who's talking to wait a minute. Shoot. I blew it. How did I move so far ahead? All right. So who's talking to Gridley all the time? Tench is. And Tench is coming right out of Montclair, right? Where his sister lives, and this guy has gone to England, super important, close with the crown, and so on and so forth, right? I mean, it's thick as thieves through Baltimore and these people, and so we go on, and we say that many of the early engineers were French, right? Who has major French connections? Charles Carroll does. His grandfather does. Tench here speaks French, and they mentioned that, that Louis Deportel, he goes up and down the East Coast and these colonies, and also he says that he's directed the construction of the siege works at the Battle of Yorktown. Right. So who else was at the Battle of Yorktown? That's right. Tench was. Tench gets to deliver the terms of surrender that Cornwallis had to sign to the Congress. Right. So he's there. I mean, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers digging out the dirt. This whole idea of, at least out of Maryland, and I'm sure it works across the board. You'll find the families, the major families that were in charge of these early settlements. I mean, it's just starting to make sense, at least as this story wants to tell itself, that these were charter families coming over here with a job. They weren't entrepreneurs looking to create businesses for themselves. These were super rich guys who moved over here when there allegedly was nothing, right? These millionaire guys creating charter programs, coming over here, on some of them on the very first ships, Delaware, and there was some of these guys whose names I've forgotten now, were part of the very first couple of episodes. These were super rich guys funding these things, and they were coming over here, and like I said, they were going to live in wood huts, wood shacks, created on beaches for them. No, there it's way deeper, right? So he's there, Tench at all of this stuff. He's communicating back and forth. The Carrolls all speak French. There's a bunch of French engineers roaming around the country, digging up star forts and making a bunch of noise. And so they're putting out newspaper articles and they're drumming up fake journals. They got some guys that they sent over, and they taught them their letters and how to write and stuff. And now they're standing over them. Write. You say this. They're putting out newspaper articles talking about fighting the British and, creating all this diversionary sort of tactics, And then here, from 1794 to 1802, that's right in the same window that they quote unquote refortified Fort McHenry, created it as the star fort it is today from the earthworks that regular citizens did in 1775, and I showed a map from 1792 that shows it clearly as a star. I wish I thought to brought up maps before I did this. So, and then it says, as the Army Corps of Engineers is known today, came into existence in March of 1802, President Thomas Jefferson signed the Military Peace Establishment Act. Peace Establishment Act. What? See, I wish I see you guys are coming with me today because I didn't really go through all this. I just brought up a couple windows I thought I would need, and I just hit record. So again, and he sets up the whole idea at West Point, and I talked already a little bit about how the there are so many star forts along the Hudson River, and West Point was at Hudson River. You look at some of those buildings, those early buildings, as I showed in one of the earlier videos I did, those West Point buildings, some of them look very like they could be recovered properties, a bunch of older structures from whatever civilization or culture was here before. And so here there's a picture, allegedly a picture of them doing Mississippi River improvement, but who's to say they just haven't eliminated all kinds of evidence? Who's to say they aren't creating dams and creating lakes and things like this to just wipe out evidence of stuff, because they do it. We know there are submerged towns, like old West towns and stuff like that. We know that stuff happens. Why not just bring that, pull the lens back further on that in our timeline, I'm not going to go too much further here. So the General Survey Act of 1824 authorized the use of the Army engineers to survey road and canal routes. So they get to make the maps. They get to tell the future where to go, right? And they get to divert the attention from places they don't want people to go to until, they're the ones responsible for this, In 1838, the topographical engineers consisted only of officers, and was used from so the connected guys, the guys in on it, they're the ones making the maps, right? And we're gonna get more into maps, but you've seen it, and other channels have used maps and stuff. How amazing some of those maps look, how detailed they are down to, it's incredible, the map work, and I'm going to use Baltimore maps coming up soon, because we're getting there, we're getting to the digging, we're getting to the removal of the mud, and I'm going to get to go start looking at buildings and stuff that So I'm excited about this work that's happening. I know it's not the most exciting stuff in the world. So here they created an, wait a minute. So it was merged with the Corps of Engineers on 31st March of 1863, at which point the Corps of Engineers also assumed the Lakes Survey District mission for the Great Lakes. So I don't know if it was the John. See, and again, I hate mentioning channels' names if I'm not sure where I saw the research, but I believe it was John Levi who did something on maps in a recent one where they showed that the Great Lakes weren't there, and I think that's interesting with this and maybe some of the Great Lakes and the canals and stuff were created, artificially flooded on a mass scale to cover up the evidence of the civilizations that were there. I don't know, just a thought. Seeing this and making a connection to that video and that map that he talks about where the Great Lakes aren't there. 1841 created the Great Lakes Survey out of Detroit. So here we're getting close to the end now. Played a significant role in the American Civil War. Of course it did, because again, this is when, a lot of that stuff would have been really happening in earnest. The infrastructure was all set and laid. It took 150 years or so, 200 years to get it all set up and running, because like I said, populations were small, and who knows how many people were actually working on this stuff and what kind of tech those early, because that's another thing. All of this stuff was arranged and done, on horseback with handwritten letters. Could take, a couple of weeks, I'd imagine, for something to get from Baltimore to Boston on horseback. At least a week, right? I mean, they couldn't do that stuff in 48 hours, could they? I mean, maybe they could. I don't know. So the travel of information, they want us to believe, was significantly slower than it is today. But how could that be when they organize so much stuff? How could that French general, who's how could he get all up and down and oversee engineering projects of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers all over the place from 1775 to 1800? Without efficient travel, without the spread of the efficient spread of information or exchange of information. I mean, this the letter carrying thing and handwritten letters. We saw that Jefferson had a device that could create multiple copies of letters, so he could send stuff out in different directions, I guess, by horseback. Maybe that's part of the part of the lie they tell, or they've created to cover up their tracks, that there was wireless communication and wireless energy and stuff that they may have been utilizing at that stage, only to create this false infrastructure and this other energy sources that they've enslaved us to, and for what would be the future for them. So they were responsible for, in this during the Civil War, they were responsible for building pontoon and railroad bridges, forts and batteries, the destruction of enemy supply lines, and the construction of roads. So here we go. So the maps that these officers were making, to create roads. Okay, so for the second day in a row, my life gets blown up, and I had a good head of steam going there too. So let's see if I can just pick this up and wrap it up quickly, because I know I was nearing the end of my half hour there. So it says that they were responsible for building pontoon and railroad bridges, forts and batteries, and the construction of roads, right? So so all those officers, all those people who are doing the topography, dictate where these roads are going to get built and so forth, right? And again, they have this nice cover story of war going on, and they have people in cities and stuff, and they need to explain away the sounds that are happening, like the explosions and things like this, and the Gatling gun is a nice maybe substitution for a jackhammer, right? What's making those weird sounds out there? It's this Gatling gun, right? So anyway, so it says that also that once the South had seceded from the Union, among the different acts passed at the time, a provision was included that called for the creation of a Confederate Corps of engineers, right? So, they just found a way to split the bill, you know, to maybe to double charge, slick. um, so it says the progression of the war demonstrated the South's disadvantage in engineering expertise. So the weaker ones went south, right? Of the initial 65 cadets, or maybe it's just they didn't have as many guys go south. Maybe only 7 were placed in the Corps of Engineers. To overcome this obstacle, the Confederate Congress passed legislation that gave a company of engineers to every division in the field. Interesting. The Army Corps of Engineers served as a main function in making the war effort logistically feasible. That's an interesting way to think. They had to make the logistics. So what did they have to do? They had to clear the battlefields. How do you make a war logistic, right? That's a very interesting statement to me. So one of the main projects of the Army of the Corps was constructing One of the main projects of the Army Corps of Engineers was constructing railroad and bridges, which Union forces took advantage of because railroads and bridges provided access to resources and industry. All right, now here we go. That's where I came in. The railroad tracks, 1850, Baltimore, right to the docks. Army Corps of Engineers. It's all starting to click. Let's see. One area where the Confederate engineers were able to outperform the Union Army was in the ability to build fortifications that were used both offensively and defensively, along with trenches that made them harder to penetrate. This method of building trenches was known as the zigzag pattern. I don't know, the zigzag pattern, maybe that's Star Forts. I don't know. But that's what this seems to me is like, well, just there were, the fortifications in the South were either more ready to go, didn't require as much reconstruction as the ones up north, and that these, and that's why they were able to quote unquote outperform the Union Army in that regard. I don't know, but very interesting. And the more, the deeper I get into this story, the more feasible some of these conclusions become, at least to me. And okay, so I was a little less prepared for today than I thought. One thing I wanted to do, or I'd like to make a habit of doing, is sharing the work of other channels that are just sort of starting out, or that have a focus on sharing the, mud event or past civilization evidence that they see in their areas. And so, Serotonin here was very clever. I don't know if that's your real name or not, but very clever. I like that. She has a channel, and she's going around Toronto area, and there's some amazing buildings in Toronto. And so, like I said, I would like to support others who are doing this kind of thing, because we're all just kind of starting out, and as we're all waking up on a regional basis, I'd like to see everybody in every town, or not everybody, but at least a few people from every major city kind of documenting this kind of thing and, really pushing the envelope. And the only way we're going to spread that is by helping each other out. And so if you have a channel and you're taking pictures of your city, please let me know. I try my best to check out all my subscribers and see if they have channels and stuff, but it's getting a little bit harder for me to do that. I'm also finding that I'm having a harder time keeping up with the notifications. But I'm doing my best. And, but if you're taking pictures of your town that you think fall into the recovered, the population reset, recovered cities, that kind of thing, please let me know, and I will share your work as well. There are some amazing looking buildings in Toronto. And Sarah has some very interesting ideas, and she seems to be having a lot of fun with it. So please check out her channel. And so I'm going to try to do that as often as I can. I would like to spread the word and, like I said, create a mud flood army that will demand closer investigation into all of this. So anyway, thank you guys so much for watching. If you like what's going on over here, please like, share, and subscribe. And so until the next one, Cheers, guys.